Tu Diep. Hello, everyone. In an instant, James's world shattered before his eyes, a horrific scene that left him breathless and trembling. The weight of fear and love pressed against his chest as he stared into the darkness, knowing that Tu Diep and the baby depended on him. Would his strength and courage be enough to shield them from the storm that threatened to take everything away in that fragile moment? James realized that protecting them wasn't just his duty, it was the very reason his heart kept beating. The night air was heavy with the scent of rain and fear. James had driven through the dark countryside with his heart pounding so violently that every bump in the road felt like an echo of disaster. The headlights cut through sheets of mist, revealing the farmhouse in fragments, the pear trees bowing under the weight of the storm, the porch light flickering like a dying heartbeat. He could already sense something was terribly wrong. When he stepped inside, the kitchen chair lay overturned, crayons scattered across the floor like shattered fragments of a simple, happy life. A single pear rolled across the tiles and stopped at his boot, in the corner. The window was cracked open, rain spattering the curtains. His voice broke as he called, "Diep." The silence that followed was more frightening than any scream. Minutes earlier, Tu Diep had been humming to the baby growing inside her, her hands resting gently on her belly. Knee had been coloring by the window, her soft laughter mixing with the sound of distant thunder. Then a shadow passed outside, quick, deliberate, and dangerous. By the time James arrived, the world he had fought to rebuild was already unraveling. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number: "If you want to see them again, you'll walk away from the bridge deal. Don't involve the police." His blood ran cold. He knew this was John's revenge, the grudge that had simmered for years finally erupting. James staggered back, gripping the edge of the table as though the wood could hold him up. All his power, his boardroom victories, and his wealth meant nothing now. He was just a man staring into the abyss, realizing that the two people who mattered most might be gone for a moment. Doubt gnawed at him. Had he been foolish to think he could keep them safe in a world full of grudges and greed? But then he remembered Diep's trembling voice the night she promised they would face storms together. He thought of Nee's laughter in the orchard, of the way Diep's eyes softened whenever she looked at him. The fear hardened into something else, a desperate, unwavering determination. James called his brother, his voice a controlled whisper. "It's John, he has them. I need every contact, every lead, and I need you to keep this quiet." His mind raced through every connection, every piece of evidence they had gathered against John. There had to be a way to turn the tables without endangering Diep or the baby. Hours passed like years. Outside, the storm broke, lightning slicing the sky. Inside the farmhouse, James spread maps and photos across the table, tracing possibilities with shaking hands. He remembered the abandoned warehouse near the old canal, a place John had once used for shady deals. As dawn painted the fields in a pale, merciless light, James gripped the steering wheel of his truck, every muscle taut. He wasn't a CEO now. He wasn't a man burdened by land disputes and rivalries. He was simply a father-to-be, a protector, and a man who would walk into the fire for the people he loved. The drive to the warehouse was a blur of wet roads and broken prayers. When he finally saw Diep through a grimy window, her face pale but defiant, her arms wrapped protectively around her belly, his chest tightened with both relief and rage. John's men circled her like wolves. James took a deep breath, the storm inside him steadying into resolve. He knew the next moments could change everything: his company, his freedom, his future, but none of that mattered anymore. He whispered into the dawn, "Hold on, Diep, hold on, little one. I'm coming for you." And as he stepped out into the mud, the world around him seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if love and determination would be enough to save them. James crept through the dripping trees, his boots sinking into the mud with every careful step. The warehouse loomed ahead, an ugly, rusted skeleton of steel and broken windows. Through the cracked panes, he could see the faint flicker of a lantern and John's men pacing like predators. He crouched behind an old tractor tire, forcing himself to breathe quietly. His hands shook, not from fear for himself, but from the image of Diep's pale face and the thought of the unborn child she cradled. 1,000 memories crashed over him at once: her laughter under the pear trees, Nee's small fingers clutching his hand, the night Diep had whispered, "We're still here." Inside, Diep held her ground. Her wrists were bound, but her gaze was fierce. She spoke calmly to John, though her heart pounded against her ribs. "You don't have to do this. Hurting us won't change the past." John's expression twisted. "Your family stole everything from mine. James will learn what it feels like to lose." His voice cracked on the last word, a hint of pain beneath his fury. James slipped closer. Circling the side of the building, he spotted an unlocked side door, its hinges rusted but still functional. Every step felt like a gamble, every breath a promise. He knew one mistake could cost them all. Inside, the air smelled of oil and rain. James picked up a length of metal pipe from the floor, cold, solid, and reassuring in his grip. He could hear John's men muttering near the lantern's glow. Then a shout. John had seen a shadow move. "James!" John's voice echoed through the warehouse, sharp and triumphant. "I knew you'd come running like a fool." James stepped into the light, pipe in hand, mud streaking his shirt. His jaw was tight, but his voice was steady. "Let them go, John. This ends now." One of the henchmen lunged, and James swung, the pipe connecting with a clang. The fight was brutal and fast, adrenaline replacing fear, desperation replacing doubt. Diep screamed his name, but she also watched with a quiet, unspoken trust. John grabbed Diep, using her as a shield. "Drop it, or she's gone." James froze, every muscle aching with the choice before him. He dropped the pipe, letting it clatter to the ground. But his eyes never wavered. "If you hurt her, you'll destroy yourself, John. This isn't justice, it's just hate." Something flickered across John's face, hesitation, grief. The ghost of the boy he once was before revenge consumed him. For a heartbeat, the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. Then, a siren wailed in the distance. James's brother had called for backup after all. The distraction was enough. Diep twisted away, and James lunged, tackling John to the ground. The two men grappled in the mud until John's strength faltered. When the authorities stormed in moments later, they found James cradling Diep, his face buried in her hair. She trembled against him, whispering through tears, "I knew you'd come." James looked down at her, one hand resting on her belly. "I almost didn't," he admitted, voice hoarse. "But I couldn't imagine a world without you." Outside, dawn broke fully, painting the warehouse in soft gold. For James, the nightmare wasn't entirely over. The battles with shareholders, the scars of betrayal, and John's lingering threats would remain. But as Diep pressed her hand over his heart, and the promise of their baby stirred between them, James felt for the first time in weeks that hope was stronger than fear. The world was still dangerous, but love messy, fragile, and fierce was enough to make him fight again. The morning sun filtered through the pear trees as James drove Diep and me back to the farmhouse. The storm had passed, but the land still glistened with raindrops like scattered diamonds. Diep leaned against the window, her hand protectively over her belly, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving behind a quiet ache. Nee, who had been safely returned to them by James's brother after the rescue, clutched her coloring book to her chest, her wide eyes still haunted by the night's terror. When they arrived, James knelt in front of Nee before even stepping inside. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently, brushing her damp hair from her face. "You're safe now. No one is ever going to hurt you again." Nee sniffled and nodded, her small arms wrapping tightly around his neck. Over her shoulder, Diep watched them, tears gathering in her eyes. It wasn't just relief, it was awe at the kind of man James had proven himself to be. Later, as Nee napped curled up under a quilt, Diep stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at the orchard. The sky was a pale blue now, calm and deceptively peaceful. James came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. She leaned into him, her body trembling slightly. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her hair. Diep turned, her fingers tracing the mud-streaked edge of his shirt. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come. That you'd decide saving the company mattered more than saving us." James flinched at the thought. There was never a choice. It was always you. His voice was raw with honesty, and for a moment Diep closed her eyes, letting the words steady her. Then she opened them again, resolve hardening in her gaze. "John won't stop, James. Even if they take him in, there are people loyal to him. You can't fight this alone." James kissed her forehead, lingering there as if drawing strength. "I won't be alone," he said quietly. "I have you. And I'll find a way to end this without risking you or the baby again." That evening, as the sun dipped low, James sat on the porch with his brother, the two men speaking in hushed voices over the creak of the rocking chairs. They mapped out a plan not just to protect the family, but to rebuild the company's standing and expose John's network completely. His brother suggested discreetly gathering allies among the shareholders and community leaders who had once admired their father. James listened, the fire of determination flickering in his eyes again. Inside, Diep watched through the window as Nie stirred in her sleep and smiled faintly. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Their love had survived betrayal, jealousy, and now violence, but the future still loomed uncertain. Fragile as a pear blossom in early spring, she pressed her hand to her belly and whispered softly, "We'll make it, little one. Your father won't give up on us." Outside, James glanced back at the farmhouse. The golden glow spilling from the windows reminded him why he was still standing. For the first time since the nightmare began, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, their love was stronger than the chaos waiting beyond those pear trees. The next morning broke crisp and clear, the pear trees trembling gently in a cool breeze. James awoke before sunrise, the weight of the night's plans still pressing on his chest. He lay quietly for a moment, listening to Diep's soft breathing beside him, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. For the first time in days, there was a fragile sense of peace, but he knew it was only the calm before the next storm. Downstairs, the farmhouse smelled of fresh bread Diep had baked the night before. Nie padded sleepily into the kitchen, her hair a messy halo. She climbed onto James's lap without a word. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the small heartbeat against his chest. "Are you scared anymore, little one?" he asked. Nie shook her head slowly. "Not when you're here," she whispered. The simplicity of her words tightened his throat. By mid-morning, James met quietly with his brother and two trusted partners in the orchard, far from prying ears. They outlined the next steps, gathering evidence from the warehouse, reaching out to men who, despite their rivalry, might be persuaded to stand against John's influence, and securing the farm with discreet security. When James returned inside, Diep was in the living room, folding laundry while humming a lullaby. She looked up and caught his gaze, reading the weariness in his eyes. "You're planning something dangerous," she said softly. He didn't deny it. "I'm planning something necessary." Diep set the folded clothes aside and crossed the room to him. "James, you've already risked everything. I can't lose you." "You won't," he said, but his voice cracked on the words. He held her close, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair. "I'm not just fighting for the company anymore. I'm fighting for the life we're building for you, for Nie, for our baby." Later that afternoon, Min arrived unexpectedly, his polished car crunching over the gravel drive. He stood under the arch of pear trees, a contrast of sleek business attire against the rustic orchard. Diep greeted him on the porch, her smile polite but guarded. James approached, wary but controlled. Min glanced between them, his expression serious. "I heard what happened," he said. "John's men are dangerous. I may compete with you in business, James, but I won't stand by and watch him tear apart lives." James's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then we stand together on this." As the sun set, casting long shadows across the fields, the farmhouse glowed with lamplight, a fragile beacon against the darkness gathering beyond the hills. Diep watched James through the kitchen window as he spoke quietly with men by the barn, to men who were once rivals, now bound by a common enemy. She felt the baby move inside her and pressed a hand to her belly, whispering a promise: "Your father will keep you safe. And so will I." For the first time since the horrific night at the warehouse, hope felt tangible again, delicate, like the first blossoms of spring, but strong enough to believe in. The road ahead was uncertain, yet James knew with unwavering clarity no matter what storms awaited, his love for Diep and the baby would guide him through.